It's a series. There are 2 sessions, one session today focusing on teaching and learning, and another session on Friday where our focus is more on assessment. So over a year ago, the Economics Network ran a few sessions as part of a symposium to think about the transition of university teaching at the beginning of the COVID crisis. So at that time, over a year ago, what we said was mainly based on general pedagogical principles. We had maybe some anecdotal evidence where people had tested certain teaching approaches before COVID already. But then now, more than 1 year after that, our teaching has quite fundamentally changed. I'm sure everyone agrees. So we've tried out a lot. Some of the stuff has worked, others probably not, we all agree. And we might all be a bit exhausted from it, but I think what many of us realize is that some elements of blended learning will stay with us, and they will stay with us because they actually have worked quite well. They've enhanced the student learning experience. So today's session is really about taking stock, looking back a bit, but very much looking forward. So what has worked particularly well? And how can our experience shape teaching in the new year? The plan for today is that we are asking, Ralph and I, and I'll introduce Ralph in a second, are starting off talking a bit about blended learning. We have some plenary talks after that from colleagues who just reflect on what has worked particularly well. And then we want to give you the opportunity to discuss your experience from the last year in some breakout rooms. And we will then go back in a plenary session where we just exchange some ideas from the breakout rooms, but also from any other questions which you might have. So what I haven't done is, not everyone knows me, I guess, so I haven't introduced myself, so I'll do that now. My name is Christian Spielmann. I'm at the University of Bristol. I'm leading, together with Ralph Becker, the teaching provision of the network at the moment. And yeah, so that's me. So with me, I already said, is Ralph Becker. Hi, Ralph. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, so hi, my name is Ralph Becker. I'm from the University of Manchester. And together with Christian, we're organizing sort of the training element of the network. Ashley, do you have a slide with the breakout groups for later? Here we go. Okay.
So as we said already, we would like you to join a breakout room later on. So we need to check whether it's possible for participants to rename themselves. So we got some indication that that might not be the case, in which case we need to find a different way. Could you just try to decide which of those 4 areas you would most like to discuss in the breakout groups, and we will assign you to that group. So if you could put the number of the breakout group in front of your name, that would be great. If renaming doesn't work, we'll find a different solution.
So those of you who haven't renamed, if you go on your image, you should see 3 dots at least on a Windows machine. And if you press on the 3 dots, there should be a rename.
Okay. And Andrea said she could do that. Excellent. So let's see.
If you could just add the number of the breakout room you'd like to join ahead of your name, like Ralph has done, that would be great.
So how are we doing? Yeah, so it definitely works for quite a few. If for you it doesn't work in the end, there will be the chance that you just tell us when we go into the breakout rooms, and we'll assign you then. But that's a good start. Okay, so we'll give you those breakout groups again, and we'll put them in the chat as well, so that you can self-select yourself into one of them. But I think without further ado, we should get started and thinking a bit about this very, very different year probably, and the move to blended learning. So blended learning is in everyone's words now. Everyone talks about it, but I think it's worth stepping back a bit and thinking about what does that blended learning actually mean, and how has it changed the way we organize teaching and learning. And we have a few slides for this as well, and I hand over to Ralph.
Thanks, Christian. So we thought a little bit about how do we perhaps best visualize this rather than talk too much. So here are 3 ways. The 3 ways are actually common in the sense that they try to look at the learning process from a student's perspective, and that is perhaps one of the most important sort of aspects of change of perspective for us. So Ashley, next slide, please. So the first way how you could look at what does it mean to think about blended learning is that you perhaps look at the timetable from a student perspective. Okay, so here is a timetable. You could think about this for your own unit, for one unit only, and a student could have this sort of timetable for unit. You think about sort of, a number of either places or activities on the left-hand side. So what happens on the VLE? Are there large group sessions like lectures, small group sessions? What do we do on the discussion board? What should be the self-study be? Do you have a study group? Are there any assessment things? And you could think about, and and that's part of the new thing for us, that we have to more think about, when do we expect students to do what? Okay, and not only when do we expect them to turn up into the lecture. So one way how you could think about this is that in your mind you create sort of a weekly schedule for your students. Okay, so here you'll see that sort of a week, and all the sort of prospective hours here add up to about 10 hours a week. It's like perhaps a 15 credit unit. Next slide, please. Basically, you could think about basically the same information, just in a slightly different way. Okay, but again, illustrating sort of the more broader aspect of the student learning. You could think about, when do students get exposed to new content? So I called it the new content first exposure. Sounds like a film title. And that would be perhaps in online videos, perhaps in reading. Then how do we expect students to learn, to revise, to practice? And that could be like online big group meetings, tutorials, study groups, reading, discussion boards, for instance. And then there may also be some assessment activity, perhaps an online quiz. Right? So that's basically just no, you're too quick, Ashley. Thanks. Just basically the same information from the previous slide, just presented in a different way, but thinking about what do students do and why do they do it. And then perhaps on the next slide, Ashley, I'll show an example of how actually one colleague of mine in Manchester sort of helps students to sort of plan their week. It's like with a little flow chart. Okay, and so that colleague provides a flow chart to the students at the beginning of each week to basically say, look, guys, this is what I expect you to do this week: attending lectures, doing practice tests, engage on the discussion board. So
Ralph, I'm not sure if you agree, but so I think one of the most fundamental changes from pre-COVID to now is that all of us have thought much more about the student learning journey, what happens when, and that we had to do that because we were also asked to advertise this journey to the students. So the fact that we have these different blocks of asynchronous material, synchronous lectures, assessment, much more coursework assessment during the year, meant that we had to be very clear about the sequencing of learning. And I mean, you could probably say, well, we should have done that all the time, even pre-COVID, right? We wanted to facilitate learning, so the learning journey of this from student side should always be top. But I don't think we have always done that, because it was very easy to just think of, what do I do in the lecture? What do I do in the small group session? And make sure that this is kind of aligned in some way, maybe even with the assessment. I mean, that it's very easy to step back to that level. But I feel this has really changed, that we as instructors have to think and sketch out the student learning journey much more.
I actually totally, as much as it pains me, Christian, I totally agree with you on this point. And it's also, and I think that has been a huge benefit to our students, and one we should certainly keep, that we were sort of forced to make our VLE reflect this journey or support that journey as much as possible. Whereas previously our virtual learning environments too often were just used sort of as a dumping ground for documents, rather than to actually support the learning process of students. And that sort of structuring the VLE to support such a journey was, I think, an additional huge benefit.
I mean, I also feel that each of those blocks now have kind of created new questions or new challenges. So I think that was another change we have seen by moving to blended. And like in the past, we might have thought, oh, my lecture didn't work, or the small group sessions don't really work. We get the feedback is not that great. But it feels now, as we are planning many more parts of the learning journey, that there are more aspects which can go wrong, which I have to think about how to do it in the best pedagogical way. And I think that also came out in the questions we asked participants before this symposium.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And actually, some of the questions which you guys sort of posed, or responses you gave us, and one of the questions we asked was, what do you need help with? One of the questions that came up from you guys was that it's a bit overwhelming, actually, as a teaching, as a lecturer, to now all of a sudden have to think about all these different aspects, and think about all of them, what works and what doesn't. And in addition, of course, that having to take care of so many more things also may involve additional time commitments, which made the last year very, very challenging, if not sometimes overwhelming for us. And that was certainly an aspect that came up. And we hope we have later one of the parallel sessions. For those of you who have that sort of question, we have a special parallel session, group out session on that sort of aspect. But there, indeed, Christian, as you said, if you think about the elements here, you asked questions or posed queries on each of those. How do I engage students in large online meetings? What do I do with them if I'm not delivering content in them? Because that's really a big challenge. Or other questions were about, how do I make videos engaging? That on this, actually, we'll have to admit we possibly won't give you much advice today. But there were also there were questions about interactive textbooks, and we'll have a little sessions here, but also mainly about, how do I present material in an exciting way? How do I motivate students? These were sort of questions, and we hope that some of the aspects, especially now in the plenary discussion, what follows next, we help you with some of these aspects.
That's right. And I guess that then also links to our Friday session on assessment, because in a way we are focusing on the learning journey during the week, but somewhere in there is assessment. And we talked about alignment in the past, how assessment needs to be aligned with what we teach, because it gives the student a clear incentive structure. So teaching and assessment needs to be aligned. And now there are many more aspects which we are designing in the teaching, which also has to be aligned with the assessment. So the assessment focus will be for the session on Friday. Great. So I wonder if we should quickly put the groups into the chat one more time. I saw there are a couple of joiners after we started, so welcome everyone. We will have later in our session today a part where we ask you to go in breakout groups to discuss a topic. If you haven't done so yet, could you rename yourself in Zoom? So in front of your name, as many have done already, could you put the number of the breakout room you would be most interested in participating and discussing? So if you could just do that, if you haven't done so, I see many have done this already. That would be great. And I think without further ado, we should then go into our plenary sessions here and presentations. So the idea is that colleagues very briefly share some of their insights from the last year, and the focus is on what has worked particularly well. We want to make this session one which is forward-looking. A lot of elements of blended learning will stay with us, and we would like to focus on those. And we have made sure that there are some tips and tricks, and sharing good practice is as part of this. This is a snapshot. I mean, we are not able to talk about everything we have done, but I think it gives us a good feeling about some ideas where we just can share some good practice, which is hopefully good for all of us. We have created a Padlet. Ralph just put that into the chat. Thanks, Ralph. So if you have any questions, so the presentations are very short, 5 to 10 minutes only. So we would encourage you to put any questions or any thoughts you have for the different presentations into the Padlet. And what we will do then, we will go back to your questions at the very end of today's session in the plenary discussion. So the speakers might not pick up on your questions in the chat. If you could use the Padlet, and we just collect your ideas and make sure we try to respond to as many as we can. Great. So I think it's Ralph first, and yeah,
that's right.
Go ahead.
That's right. So I'm gonna, let me look at my time. Okay. So I'm gonna quickly talk about an interactive textbook, which we have used in one very big first year course to present material. So actually in that course, so that's advanced maths first year course, very little of the material was actually presented through videos. You'll see I will support it in what way. And I just want to quickly introduce this and give you an sort of idea. So actually that was too quick. So here you see this, this page was organized by weeks. Okay, that's actually sort of a little overview here of what happens during that week. And here is the material. So this is how this looks like. In the first instance, it just looks like a website with material, and you can sort of move backwards and forwards. You can tie in videos, but of course, every website by itself can do that. That's not really what makes it interactive. So here's a video. So, yeah. I don't need to hear me. And it's basically embedded here, some whiteboard work. And what makes this an interactive textbook is that in this particular engine, I'll tell you at the end what engine it is, you can build in questions. So you have text, a video, and here, for instance, here's a question. Here there are some functions, and I'm asking students to match these functions to two plots, and they can sort of answer something and then check, how did I do? Okay, that's right. That is, that's wrong. There isn't much feedback here on this one, and change it around and check, and now it's right. Okay, and in some sense, you've already seen the main elements of this in interactive textbook. It's text, it's videos, and then it's questions. Okay, and if I move further down here, it's basically like a maths textbook, and then again, after the next bit of content, there's again some question here which students can answer. So here it's a multiple choice question, but there are all sorts of questions. You can have questions where they have to type in numbers. You can even use algebra, although then you have to teach them the syntax. And again, they can check where they're right and wrong. If they're wrong, then you can decide that they should see some feedback here, and then I can perhaps get it right the next time. Indeed, they got it right now. So this is what I call an interactive textbook, and basically the material in this course unit was exclusively presented with this interactive textbook. Now, what this particular engine is called Mobius. I know there's another one. There are several other ones. I know Exerter is a similar engine. Of course, you need to check whether your university has a license for any of that. Many of them are not really cheap. I actually don't know the price for this, but the university has a license. The nice thing here is it accepts basically LaTeX. I can copy and paste just LaTeX stuff into here, which is great. Now, let me tell you something about what students thought about this. The student feedback on this has been more positive than I imagined in my wildest dreams. The usage statistics, I can see, of course, the usage statistics. I can see that in almost every week, almost every student actually looks into the textbook. Okay, so it's actually really, they tell me that around 60–70% of the students said, I look at the material in the week in which it is assigned. And only a small number of students, when I asked them, said, I only look at it before the exam. And the actual usage statistics, which I can get in the background, sort of confirms that story. And students really, I asked at the end of the year, I asked students, you know, when we go back to lectures, would you be happy to go back to normal lectures, or would you prefer to have material presented like this? And overwhelmingly they say, no, leave lectures more interactive, more review and Q&A type, and keep on presenting material like this. So here are my quick fire 5 tips for this, because I wanted to end this. Okay, mix the media, but don't shy away from asking students to read. Okay. Think carefully where you need videos, and you want them where your narrative, you're talking, really adds the most to the story. Okay. Introduce short exercises, often short ones, and scaffold them properly. So first present a worked solution, and then the same type of questions to ask students. And you may also, although I haven't done that here, include clearly labeled stretch materials. So this is advanced material, guys. This is, if you are aiming for grades above 80, we expect you to know this sort of stuff, and you may want to label that clearly. So I think my 5 minutes are over. And,
exactly over. Well timed, Ralph. Thank you. Great. Brilliant. So the next presentation is Dimitra and Caroline. So just over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll kick off the session. So this session is about online large lectures, and Caroline and I are going to share quite different experiences of how we did things at LSE and at Warwick. So this time last year, LSE started a consultation to try and figure out how we're going to deliver our lectures in the academic year 2021. And LSE hired some external consultants, and they told us to split our content into bite-sized chunks, deliver them asynchronously, and then use our live sessions to do other material, which I know is what has been done elsewhere. And then we consulted with our students, and they said, please don't do that. We don't want that at all. What we want, what our LSE students told us was, we would like to experience the LSE experience remotely. And the way they expressed it is, we're all from all over the world. We're spread internationally. If you take away our live opportunity to go online and see other fellow students in a sort of lecture environment, you reduce our live contact time by a significant margin. And we really want it to be as similar as it could to the LSE experience. So when we sort of went away to think about this, we realized that what the students wanted was opportunities to engage live. So we made the decision at LSE to deliver all our lectures live. We didn't pre-record, except in 2 first-year courses where there was some asynchronous content that was given in advance of the live lecture. So we had to plan all our lectures live. So the challenge became, how do we engage our students in this setting? So what we did is a number of things. So I'll explain what we did in my course very briefly, and other courses did iterations of this. So I guess the things that stood out is we very much thought about how students would engage with each other as part of our course and how that would happen in and outside the lecture. So for example, we decided to introduce coursework that was based on student interaction on a regular basis and opportunities for students to meet others to discuss things that occurred in the lecture. So it was all about the live engagement and students having opportunities to engage with each other, both inside the live lecture and outside, and also to create a sense of community. So for example, we had a course playlist where students sent in music, and that's how lectures kicked off. And amazing as it may sound, students arrived early to see if their song would be played, because they would send it to me and they didn't know which ones I would play, and there was time for 2. So I actually started the lecture early so I could fit in 3. Now I have about 600 students, so that was a lot of songs. So they, you know, things like that seem to work. The chat, we use the chat very much. Now with hundreds of students, that became an issue. So my team of class teachers would have a rota and they would come in and help on the chat. So using the chat, using the polls, using playlists, using study groups. Another aspect was using increasing contact hours. So at LSE, we didn't sort of go to video recordings. We, for large courses, we replaced our office hours with an extra live hour of Q&A and free chat. So we would go in and any questions that would come up on a Padlet or on Piazza we addressed, or a past paper question, or to discuss a reading. It was very free. And this free hour is brilliant because it's a bit unscripted, but you can have wonderful conversations. So I'll pass on to Caroline because I'm mindful of the time.
Okay, thank you, Dimitra. So Dimitra and I spoke a couple of weeks ago and we discovered that Warwick and LSE had taken totally different approaches. So Dimitra said about what the external consultants came in and said to the LSE students said that's not what they wanted. I don't think Warwick did get external consultants in, but we took the approach that the external consultants recommended. So for a typical module, usually there'd be 2 hours of lectures per week. And so we were encouraged to make 1 hour of asynchronous recordings, broken up into approximately 20-minute chunks. And then we would give a 1 hour online synchronous lecture. But it was made clear that we shouldn't introduce new material into these online synchronous lectures. These sessions were for going into material in more detail. And I think, as with a lot of people, I was a little bit nervous about how this would work. And when I first gave some of these online lectures, I was surprised how well I thought they did work. I lecture industrial economics. I was lecturing a 3rd year industrial economics module with way over 100 students on it. So I planned the material quite carefully in advance. And so I would give the students an opportunity to tell me what were the topics in the news that week that linked to the material on the module. I'd give them opportunity to ask questions on the assessment, give them opportunity to ask questions on the recorded materials, and then I would have a number of questions for them. And the 50 minutes flew by, and I thought, this is great. But increasingly, I was worried that maybe students were a little bit like me. And I remembered as an A-level student, for one particular A-level I didn't like, I would ask my lecturer questions so that there was less time for the teacher to get us to do work in the class. And I was worried that lots of students were asking questions, and maybe it was because they were just genuinely interested. Maybe it was because they thought it was a way of avoiding doing work themselves. So I was also worried that not all the students were getting to contribute. And Dimitra said that at LSE they had assistants who could monitor the chat, and we didn't have this. Some lecturers took the approach that they would stay online for maybe another half an hour after the lecture to answer the questions in the chat. I found it okay to answer questions in the chat because I had 150 students. I didn't have 600 students in my module. But when I taught a second large module online, I think the thing that really worked for me was, yes, we would have this same order where students would have an opportunity to talk about what was in the media that week, have an opportunity to ask questions about the assessments, have questions about the recorded materials. But then the students learned that every week I would give them a Padlet. They'd be told in advance what would be the key applied reading for that week. And then all the asynchronous materials tended to be quite theoretical. And then when it came to the online lecture, there would always be a Padlet where they'd have been told what was the reading they were meant to read in advance. And on the Padlet, they were meant to complete 4 questions. What were the key contributions of the paper? Also, what were the main econometric methods used in the paper? What were the strengths? What were the weaknesses of the analysis? And it worked so much better. So yes, the students had opportunities to ask questions, to answer my questions, but as well, it was a way of ensuring that everybody was encouraged to do the reading in advance, but they were encouraged to submit their opinions in this large lecture. So my big takeaway was the wonders of a Padlet. And you know, we practice what we preach. So as a result, you know, we do have a Padlet that we're all using in this session today. So that's just a quick introduction to what happened at Warwick, what I felt was helpful. So now Demetra and I have some top tips that we're going to run quickly through. So the Ashley, can you just go forward a little bit, because those are Ralph's top tips. There we go, thank you. So you've already heard that one top tip is to have a module playlist and to play songs in advance to students. I didn't do that, I'm going to try that now. But one thing I always did was join the lecture early and chat to the students who arrived early, because that's what we would do with a regular face-to-face lecture. We know that sometimes students feel uncomfortable turning their cameras on, but just for those few minutes before the lecture, if students were comfortable, I encouraged them to turn their cameras on. And we would just wave at each other just to say hello. So that was really helpful to have those conversations we'd usually have, saying, how's your week gone so far? How's the pressure of work? How are you coping with the online learning? And getting to know some of those students by name and putting a face to the name. So that was really helpful. Okay, Demetra, the second one yours.
Thanks. So you talked about the playlist. So another aspect was announcing a clear structure for the session, and also for yourself, thinking about what students will do at different points. Where will you embed things like a poll? Where would you use the chat? But more importantly, in a large lecture, especially if you don't have assistance, you might want to think about advising students when you're going to be taking their questions. So are they going to be posting a bunch of questions and you'll interrupt the lecture to answer them, or you answer them at a later date? So think a little bit about how you will engage students and then how they'll get something from you. Go ahead.
Okay, so we've already mentioned that we planned how we would get students to engage and what would be the different elements to the lecture. So then the next 2 points are related. It's often good to start a lecture, as you would with a face-to-face lecture, by asking the students questions and using polling. And so one thing that can be really effective is just having very quick polls with students where you ask them to use one-word answers or thumbs up, thumbs down in the chat, just to, you know, initially engage them and to reassure them about the technology. So often at the very start, I would just say, can you use thumbs up, thumb down? Can you see me? Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Great. Ralph mentioned this before, the importance of mixed media, and there are many different ways I've seen it happen, whether it's a digital whiteboard, some more traditional colleagues who are used to actually writing on a visualizer, we got them sort of a digital visualizer. So there are ways to make the material more engaging or interactive. There is the issue of the cameras. Should cameras be on or off? That's a sensitive area. I tried to encourage students to have them on. Very few did, but that was more, I explained it was more for me to have a face to look at when I speak. But there is, of course, the issue of the fact that lectures are recorded and some students might not wish to be recorded, and many other factors that we might consider. And some students told me that they actually find it distracting to see other faces. So, you know, it's a bit mixed for online lectures where it comes to cameras, isn't it?
Okay, thank you, Dimitra. So the last 2 points we've already covered. We did encourage students to post comments and questions in the chat. Personally, I was really impressed. I was used to face-to-face lectures where you'd say to the students, has anyone got any questions? Or you'd throw a question out there and you might get a couple of nervous hands raised, even if you've got hundreds of students. The students seem to become very comfortable very quickly with using the chat to answer questions, to make comments, to ask questions. So that was great to see. But as we've said here, you need to factor in time planning if you've got a very large number of students in a session. And the final point just says, think about compiling questions for the students to engage as many as possible, for example, using Padlet. Okay, I think we've run out of time.
Yep,
so thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you so much, Dimitra. And you mentioned Padlet, and people are putting their ideas on the Padlet, which is great. So we will follow up on all of them later on. So we move straight on. I would like to talk a little bit about co-teaching. We have done that before COVID-19, but we've done it more during COVID-19. And what I would like to do is I would like to talk about, next slide, what do we mean by co-teaching? Why has co-teaching worked during the pandemic, and why do I think that co-teaching will work as a model for the future? And then I'll finish off with some tips as well. Next slide as well. Yeah. So when I say co-teaching, I do not mean sharing the workload half-half. So you do the first week, I do first 5 weeks, I do the second 5 weeks. I mean by co-teaching, modeling and performing dialogue. And this may be explaining a model to the other co-teacher. So using the other co-teacher here, this may be modeling a discussion where you have different views. This may be a conversation where one person leads and the other one adds some examples from their expertise. It works, I think, for asynchronous material as well as for live sessions, and I've used it for both. What you see here on the right-hand side is my colleague Annika Johnson and I. So this is part of a trailer which we have done every week, where we talked about and discussed what is going on in the week and did something motivational. And we very much sketched that as a conversation, sometimes as a bit of an argument, sometimes as an exploration of a topic. So this is what I mean by co-teaching. Next slide. So why did it work during the pandemic? It came out from people like Caroline, Dimitra, Ralph, what they said. Online teaching is actually quite tricky, and multitasking is hard, especially if you have large groups. So having a co-teacher from the staff side it can help us with that feeling it's all too much. So co-teaching can provide help. It fills gaps. If I do something on the chat or load another slide, someone else can talk, and it smoothes out the narrative. So that's one advantage. It's not the main advantage, and I'll come to that in a bit. From the student perspective, we got a lot of feedback about online lectures can be very boring and not very engaging, and Dimitra and Caroline talked about how to improve on that. But one way of improving on that is also to have different people talking, to have moments of surprise, moments of tension, and that is something which we have tried to model in the online world. So creating this atmosphere of suspense in a real room is much easier. So I think it can help to have another person have another person in the online room to shake things up a little bit. Great, next slide. So why do I think that co-teaching will work in the future, and is something we should think a little bit more about going forward? So I really think that these other advantages in the online world maybe were not the main advantages of co-teaching. They were nice byproducts in a way. So in a way, I believe that the real advantage is a pedagogical one. And I think it transfers well into the face-to-face world as well, because these pedagogical benefits are there as well. And one is related to the Socratic method. So this is the use of a constructive dialogue and an argument, which is said to stimulate critical thinking. So in a way, what we are doing here is we are modeling this dialogue, and the student is a participant in this dialogue. One way would be it could be one way to make the student part of this learning experience, of this construction of knowledge. So the co-teacher can take on, for example, the student perspective, can ask the questions the student would ask. It can help us, if it's well designed, with scaffolding the thought process. There could be an initial comment, then the co-teacher comes in, questions something, then we are building up knowledge step by step. And co-teaching can work quite well here. I think it's dynamic, it's flexible, and that's something we know is good for learning, because we are constructing knowledge on the go. We are not just telling students what we have in mind, we are constructing it on the spot with them. And that's an engaging format which I believe can be really beneficial for learning. So how to make it work? Next slide. So I think my tip is to know your co-teacher well. Discuss with your co-teacher personality. How does it work? How do you want to create this performance? So co-teaching is a performance, I think, and you need to know what you are comfortable with and how you would like to perform that. I do think you need a script. It's more than just having a friendly chat about a topic. So co-teaching should be crafted with the student in mind, like to think about how do you have to scaffold the learning. It's not a conversation for you, it's a conversation you perform for the student. I think using elements of dialogue to create the learning experience is really important. So think about what dialogue you use, build and scaffold thought processes. I think it works well to keep both speakers visible because it underlines this element of conversation. To make that the most out of it, discuss cues, discuss signals with your co-teacher. When is it good for the other one to come in to make the conversation dynamic? I think it's maybe not that easy the first time round. The more you do it, the better you know your co-teacher, the better the flow is, and the more you can achieve. So I do think you should evaluate probably what you've done after session, what went well, what didn't went well, and that's how we can all learn. Last slide. So you may know that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a BBC series produced purely on Zoom. It was called Stage, and it was featuring David Tennant and Michael Sheen as the main actors. And I just thought if two people can create a BBC series and engage people and keep people on the spot and engaged, why should we not be able to do the same? So I think it's a good one to try, and I would definitely like to keep some of that. Thank you very much. Great. And following on from that, it's Ian with his 5 minutes. Go for it.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So I'm Ian Long. I'm the new-ish Director of Undergraduate Economics at Cardiff. I say new-ish because in a moment of madness, I decided to take on the role in September 2020, just as we were starting to plan for this academic year. So what I'm going to be talking through is some of my reflections. Partly it's the pandemic, partly it's, I suppose, my first year in the role as a program director. So hopefully none of it's repeating stuff that everybody else already knows, but I can't guarantee it. So I was reflecting on why managing student expectations has been such a difficult thing to do during the pandemic, particularly around workload. And what I kind of came to is the crux of the issue is that there is a trade-off between the speed and the scale of adoption of different teaching techniques and how easy it is to manage student expectations and anxieties. So pre-COVID, if one module leader starts adopting something new, then students have got space to learn how to adapt to that particular style of teaching. But because COVID hit suddenly and everybody had to adopt a very, very different, very new style of teaching, this has caused a lot of issues, particularly around workload, but also in terms of students' expectations and anxieties. So they're having to, first of all, work out how to learn in this new environment, how to best use the learning activities. They've also got to deal with teachers who are also trying to learn how to use the techniques. Blended learning does involve more independent work. They're taking on more responsibility. And there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that, particularly with assessments and things that are going online. So I think a lot of the issue that we've had this year around managing expectations is perhaps transitional, but I think there's definitely elements that we'll be taking forward, particularly with dealing with first years. And I suppose I should note that for our undergraduate students, I'm the first economist that they meet. So a lot of that transition from school to university is something that I've been dealing with for years. And obviously this has made the problem a lot more acute. So what are my reflections on the last academic year about how we manage expectations? Well, I did briefly contemplate putting a slide up about Bayesian game theory, but I decided it was probably too early in the morning and people have been marking too many exams to do that. But it's true that this is a Bayesian game where people are updating expectations. And just as in game theory, expectations and equilibrium are a feature of the equilibrium, so it is with student expectations here. We can't think of student expectations and managing them in a vacuum. It's got to be a collaborative process between all stakeholders. So I'm not just talking about module leaders, I'm talking about class teachers, program directors, professional services colleagues as well. It's got to be the case that we all converge towards a kind of clear idea of what it is that we're supposed to be doing, where responsibilities lie. And if there's any uncertainty or ambiguity from any of these actors, it's going to increase workload, it's going to increase anxiety. Now, the second thing that I think is really important is to acknowledge the uncertainty. So don't claim that we have all the answers. But also one thing that I found really useful when dealing with students who are struggling is to note that everybody is struggling, including academics. So students quite often were complaining to me that academics weren't, say, uploading their pre-recorded lectures at the same time every week. And I had to say to them, well, look, that's probably because these academics, in addition to doing their work, they're having to manage homeschooling of their own kids. They possibly have elderly relatives that they're having to look after because they're self-isolating. Just as the students are having mental health concerns, you know, that a lot of academics are. And, you know, I think in terms of empathizing with the students, I'm kind of in a slightly fortunate position. I never thought I'd say that, but for those of you who know me quite well, you know, I'm probably not the easiest person to talk to, and that's because I suffer from social anxiety and I have to take antidepressants every day. And that's something that I've always kind of kept really quiet, but it's really common now and it helps put students at ease. Now, the third thing that was a bit of a surprise to me was that under normal circumstances, we'd just kind of try and set expectations at the start of the year, and then that would be it. But for various reasons under COVID, and as we're adopting blended learning, it needs much more constant attention. And I have to say that the people in this Zoom meeting are probably the worst offenders, because we're the ones that are reflective. We're the ones that are constantly adapting and tweaking and changing our teaching in order to make improvements. But every time we do that, students are kind of worrying about how that change is going to affect the way that they've just learned to deal with the learning activities we were doing last week or 2 weeks ago. And so we're actually adding to their workload by adapting the way that we're teaching constantly. So it does need more constant attention. And we need to think as lecturers and as module leaders, as program directors, about how often we're changing what we're doing in response to changes in the pandemic or in response to our own self-reflection that potentially adds to student anxiety and causes them to have an even greater workload than they otherwise would do. Now, I suppose this probably sounds quite obvious, but the one thing that's really kind of come out to me this year is that the messaging that we give to students around everything from workload to learning activities to what they can expect from each module needs to be clear, consistent, and persistent. Now, that was, of course, true pre-COVID. But what we found is that students have become even more reliant, because they're learning remotely, on these informal group chats and networks that they've always had, but they've always also all been in the same room and they've listened to the same information. And what we're finding is that you have one module leader who says something slightly out of kilter with what the program director has been saying, and it goes into the group chat, and then it gets warped and changed and kind of misinterpreted. And before you know it, you've got a whole load of students that are really struggling to work out what's going on and what the rules are, and they're getting really, really worked up. So it's really important that the messaging that you give them across the board from every individual that they interact with within the school, within the department, has got a relatively consistent message, and you keep persisting with the same thing. So eventually, as they're updating their beliefs, this message starts to go through. And what I do actually say to students when they email me is I say, look, feel free to put this on a group chat. Say that you've contacted the program director. He has said this. Here is verbatim the email that I got in a reply. This is the message that's going out. Again, to try and combat not the formal channels, the students have panels and the like, but the informal ones, which have become so much more important to students and have made our job in terms of managing expectations a lot more difficult. And finally, and this is something that's already been touched upon, the colleagues need support in order to meet these student expectations. So if we engage in managing student expectations, it's really important we do, we need to make sure that we meet them. And if you have colleagues doing different things and not really understanding what the expectations that their students have of them are, then that's when we start to get into problems, and that's when the anxieties and complaints about workload start to arise. So we need to make sure, particularly with perhaps less engaged colleagues or older colleagues who aren't used to the technology. I mean, we've already talked about people who've got digital visualizers. You know, some of my colleagues used to, or still, if they had the chance, they carry around an overhead projector with them and set that up in the lecture theatre and write on transparencies. You know, these people in particular really need support in order to meet our students' expectations. So in terms of concrete steps that you can take, here are my tips. So firstly, a lot of it's just about doing the basics well. It's the stuff that we've always talked about as long as I've been involved in the economics network. It's about doing things like communicating module structure in a very clear and transparent way. And I know Ralph has already put up some kind of versions of a weekly module map. I'll just briefly, if I can, share mine. So here we go. This is what we've been encouraged to do. So for each topic that the students are going to deal with in each week, we've got the intended learning outcomes, we've got the content that they're supposed to be dealing with, where they can find it on our virtual learning environment, how long it's going to take, and then when to start it, when to finish it, and how it relates to assessment. And one thing I'll pick up on here is another reason perhaps that student workload has increased is the fact that they're having to deal with a lot more topics than they did previously. If you've got a kind of live session, a synchronous session on a Monday, what you're saying to the students is, right, the week before, you're going to watch the pre-recorded lectures. Then you're going to have the live session. Then you're going to do an exercise and you'll have the tutorials or whatever the following week. And then you're going to have to review it. So actually each topic you cover takes 4 weeks, and that's going to overlap a lot more. So it's something, again, to be mindful of. So we've actually been encouraged to try and limit workloads to 6 hours per module, which is a bit of a challenge at the best of times. So other things to highlight is that blended learning is not about more material. This is important for the students, but it's also important for module leaders to understand. It's just different delivery. It's actually taking advantage of having everybody together and not having the expert in the room kind of standing and clicking through slides, actually having a discussion with them, with the students, so that they get the most from it, and then just putting all of the kind of clicky, non-interactive stuff up front so they can watch that in their own time. Now, with that in mind,
we ask you to come to an end.
I'm coming to an end very, very quickly. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So, highlight the benefits of blended learning. I'm going to do 2 things very quickly. The first thing that we encourage our module leaders to do was to try to reduce intra and inter-module heterogeneity in delivery. So we realized very early on that students would be really anxious if all of our module leaders were doing different things. And what we tried to do was say, look, some of you will want to go on and do really, really fancy stuff. Don't do it yet. For the first half of the first semester, at least, we are all going to do exactly the same thing to let students get used to this. Don't start changing things after a couple of weeks. Keep it stable until the students have got used to it. And then the other thing that we've done is just try and keep talking. So we've had more regular discussions with academic colleagues, but we've also encouraged students to engage in new forums for discussion. So we've had town halls. But the other thing that we've done, aware of the fact that there are all of these informal channels, we've created a kind of official informal channel through a kind of a group chat website. Now, the students run this, but it's something where the people who are running it feed back to us regularly the sorts of questions that they're getting and the sorts of confusion that's arising, and then we can respond to that. So although we're not directly involved in these informal channels, we are getting input from them and we are responding to them. And that's helping dealing with the anxieties around information provision. All right, and I will stop there.
That's great.
So thank you very much.
So much, Ian. Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing insights. I think that was great and hopefully useful for everyone else. So what we would like to do next is we want you to actually talk and discuss and reflect. So we are opening up the breakout groups. In the interest of time, we keep the breakout groups to just over 15 minutes. So if you could just keep that in mind, and we will ask the facilitators at the very end, just in one sentence, when you come back, to kind of get one of the key tips or outcomes or insights and share it with the group. So put it out again. Great. So people are coming back. Welcome back, everyone. We'll just wait long enough to let the participant number stabilize. There we are. So I think everyone should be back now. Yeah, so I was just thinking, it's great. Like sometimes students, as soon as you send a message, you have 2 more minutes. The first ones are coming back already. So you kind of wonder what has happened in the breakout groups. The fact that everyone really stayed to the last seconds meant you all had a good conversation. So what we would like to do is we would just really ask the facilitators to put in one sentence, max 2, what's their main takeaway from the discussion, and just share it with everyone. So I just wonder, should we start maybe, let's mix things up a little bit. Shall we start with managing teaching on workloads? Dimitra and Ian, do you just want 1 sentence, 2 sentences? What was the main takeaway from your work?
A lot of hindsight takeaway messages, but then often with such changing circumstances, ways to reduce workload. We figured out now how to reduce workload if we had to do last year again, but with uncertainty going forward, it's not obvious how you reduce workload for the new things that will come in the future. So a lot of uncertainty, right? So it was a bit of therapy. I don't know, Ian, you might want to add something.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, no matter what's happening next year, I'm committing to continuing with blended learning. And that's going to mean that this summer I can plan the asynchronous stuff, and it'll give me an opportunity to smooth my workloads to a greater extent than I was able to last year, because everybody missed a summer because we didn't know what was going to be happening.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you very much. So shall we ask Caroline how to talk to colleagues about the benefit of blended learning?
So we found that departments had different approaches. So some departments invested in having digital technology staff. Other departments arranged to have technology champions in the department, but it was all about making sure that people felt comfortable asking questions. Fabio said that at UEA, they have these online, very informal coffee sessions where people could just chat about the challenges, and there was great take up of that, and that was really appreciated. I think the other thing that we briefly mentioned was that whereas sometimes there's been this divide between teaching focused colleagues and people on teaching and research contracts, it's been really nice this year to see that actually the stars in terms of adopting technologies in teaching have cut across those divisions, and that yes, sometimes it's teaching focused staff, but also we have some real stars on teaching and research contracts that have also been able to lead on the adoption of technology in teaching. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, and so Mario, in the 5th group, there were lots of people there. I think that just shows that the uncertainty we have to live with at the moment, like what is coming next, that there's a lot of demand for some tips. So Mario, what's the outcome from your group?
we managed to introduce each other by the last minute. It was good. And but I guess two things here. One is that, you know, if it's something that we're going to do face to face, that then could be lectures or small group teaching, it has to have some element of interaction and it has to be meaningful. We were talking about experiments with the whole class or something something like that. Something that was interesting to me to see and to share with colleagues is the fact that there is some kind of general here, well, if not concern, at least awareness that engagement might become a little bit of an issue. So how to make sure the students engage on both sides of the equation, and also with the knowledge that potentially next year we have this kind of hybrid situation with some students with us on campus and some other students potentially remotely. So how to interact and let these two groups interact.
Yeah, and I guess there's also something which came up from some comments in the Padlet that we can have our ideas about that, but then we are kind of working within an institutional system and with the institutional constraints which throughout the pandemic haven't made our life easier necessarily. Great, thank you. Ralph, discussion boards.
Yes, let me be very brief. Manage the expectations of students of what should happen on the discussion board and not. I just put something into the chat where how we used or what we did in Manchester to do that. Tie the discussion board into the rest of the unit. Don't treat it as an appendix. Also pick up questions from it in live sessions or send students in preparation for live sessions to it. Have a good organizational principle. That means you can filter, either have special forums for special topics or make sure students in a way can filter for topic questions raised on a topic, and do not engage in email conversations over content. And you have to be really strict with yourself. In the first week, students will of course send you emails. Just copy and paste the email into the discussion board, say a student asked the following question, here is my answer. And if you do that for the first 2 weeks, students will actually believe that the discussion board is the right forum. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Ralph. Mike and Steve, large online groups.
So, I mean, 15 minutes is not enough to talk about all the issues that we could have with large online groups, but effectively, we came up with two themes, and the first was that there is a risk with a large online session that the left-hand tail becomes more invisible than it would be in a live on-campus type session, because you're less able to see the engagement, you're less able to call upon individual students within sessions. The other was, even though technology has the facilities to enable collaboration through things like breakout rooms, the experience that that was shared was that actually breakout rooms, when we're going from large group sessions, were very difficult to manage, and that quite often students would either disappear in the breakout rooms, or they just wouldn't engage with each other during those sessions. So finding good ways of getting engagement through those live sessions to get the conversation started. And we discussed a few tools, such as making use of message boards and getting students talking with each other, even if it's almost an anonymized chat.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, for that. Can I ask a question to you, given what you discussed? Do you think that there is a place for sort of the traditional content lecture in our future blended world?
Well, I mean, I think there's a question about what we're thinking about a content lecture. A pure lecture which is delivered with someone standing at the front delivering material is probably not something that we'd ideally want to see, because it doesn't engage in the active learning. But if you there is a real place for an inspirational lecture, a lecture where you're delivering ideas or creating ideas and creating questions for students to go and think about. But that probably looks different to what a lot of the delivery lectures would look like. So it's finding the right place for those kind of inspirational lectures, but also thinking about how you engage with interactivity and getting students engaging with each other in large group sessions. I think it is important that there is, certainly going forward, it's probably going to be important that there's content in those sessions. I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea of purely Q&A sessions, just, but that's possibly because I'm just nervous that no one will ask any questions. And having something as a content to act as a hook for the questions, I think is a good thing.
Okay. Steve, there were a couple of things related to that on the Padlet as well. So many people think about the future of these large groups, and I guess one question is, if there is a large group element, should it be online or on campus? And the second question is, do your colleagues or our colleagues agree about that vision of the large group lecture for future teaching?
So, I mean, I think there is a temptation for quite a few colleagues to see the new normal as the old normal. So to revert to a lecture supported by small group teaching. And we know from the literature that that's not the best way of delivering material. We know that active learning activities are much more likely to gain deeper learning. So there do need to be carefully managed conversations about what the future will look like, and trying to have schools and universities thinking about moving together in harmony. I'm spotting Alvin's comment in the chat, which just made me stop for a moment. In terms of what the future would look like for large sessions, one of the things that I think is also coming out in the chat is that students often gave revealed preferences that they wanted large group sessions, but they didn't necessarily want them on campus because they wouldn't necessarily come in to campus to go to them. But what I've been told by quite a lot of students over the last year is not that they want the lecture to, they don't want the lecture to be online necessarily. They want the opportunity to go into campus if they want to. So there's an optionality in there. And I mean, that creates pressures, and one way to deal with that might be through making use of live streaming, because I think the live session, the live large group session on campus doesn't just create it isn't just a learning experience, it's also a social experience that it gives a hook for students to go and actually form the informal connections that they wouldn't necessarily gain in the online world. That's something that quite a few students have told me that they've struggled with this year, forming these informal connections, forming the group chats that they would have done through a live session in the past. They've not been able to do because they haven't had all of the informal ways of chatting. So for instance, the coffee after the lecture, they've not been able to take advantage of.
No, I think that's an excellent point, Steve. There's like going chats before and after a lecture. Can I ask Mike, because you said in the chat, surely it's the interactive lesson. So Steve in one of his comments said, well, yes, there should be interactive elements, but it may be good to also include some content elements in that. And I know, Mike, you've been basically doing flipped classroom sessions even before the pandemic. In these sessions, did you think about including also some content, or were you successful by only looking at interactive activities?
There was in the live sessions that I did when I did the flipped learning stuff, there was always something delivered. So there was either a 5-10 minute narrative or something noticed you've not understood this so much, so let's do that thing. So there was always a delivery of content, but it was an interactive. I was on the same level as them in a flat classroom, so I was discussing, I was talking. So it felt more democratic and a back and forth rather than a here's me telling you stuff. And it allowed me to kind of tailor what I was doing at the time. So I think there is room for that delivery of content or delivery of some of that harder stuff. But I think it's that design and it's getting that interaction and the discussion, I think, is really important.
I think we all agree. We could talk on this forever, and I think we will continue that conversation. We are coming to the end of our session for today. There's more to talk on Friday. The focus will be more on assessment. We realized we haven't brought all of the questions on the Padlet in. So our plan is we keep the Padlet open. We will reply on the Padlet and can use this maybe for the next 2 days a bit as a discussion board where we kind of exchange ideas on those. So a lot of the suggestions or comments, there are answers to it already. So let's continue doing that. I try to bring a few in. Then we can talk more about that. There is also an additional column now. If you have anything else you wanted to ask or comment on, which is not linked to the first talks, do use the Padlet for that as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our speakers, facilitators, and thank you very much for you to join in today and think about with us about blended teaching, about the future. I think the more we share, the better our teaching gets, because we are all going through the same experience, and I think it can be really helpful to share what works and our ideas and our reflections on that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ashley, for organizing, and see many of you maybe on Friday. Okay, and